Members, would you take your seats, please? We're just about to begin. Right, good evening, members, and welcome to this Policy and Resources Committee meeting on the 24th of January. Before we start on the agenda, may I take this opportunity to advise you that if the fire alarm does sound, please remain seated to enable Mr. Bailey on my right to assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. Tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but if anyone else is intending to record these, can you please let me know now? I ask this question not to stop you, but merely to ensure that members and other members of the public who are very noticeable by their absence tonight know that this is taking place. And I can't see that anybody is indicating, so I'll take it that nobody is going to do that. Mr. Bailey, do we have apologies for absence, please?
Councillors Garland and Harwood.
Thank you. And substitute members, if I start here and get Councillor English. And Councillor Burton.
Councillor Burton for Councillor Garland.
To come back one. Yes.
I do apologise, I didn't pick up. Councillor Blackwell is coming, but she's tied up and will be a bit late at the moment. Not literally tied up, but you know what I mean. So she won't flee. Thank you.
And Councillor McLaughlin.
I did. I had a similar observation to make as Councillor Perry. I also got the email from Councillor Blackwell.
Let's just turn the page over. I do not have any urgent items. I cannot see any visiting members. Councillor Perry, are you going to remain as a visiting member if and when Councillor Blackmore arrives? Oh, sorry. Do you know what?
I know. I'm not a visiting member. I'm not doing well tonight, am I?
No, it's I'm not doing well. So, you are a member of this committee, so... Yes. As Mrs. Broom said, you're at most committees, and which is welcome. So, are there any disclosures by members and officers tonight? No, none. Thank you. Disclosures of lobbying? Nope. Okay. There are no exempt items on the agenda. I propose that we take all the items on the agenda in public tonight. Is that agreed? Thank you. So we turn immediately to minutes of the meeting of the 13th. I'll take them as usual, page by page for accuracy. Page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Members, can I sign them as agreed and correct? Okay. Thank you very much. There are no petitions as far as I'm aware, and no questions from the public. However, I have received notice that Councillor Louise Bryce wishes to ask me a question. Councillor Bryce, just so everybody could see, I think it would be nice if you move around. I'm told you can sit at any of those positions. Okay. Before Councillor Bryce starts, has everybody seen that they have a paper in front of them? Okay. Councillor Bryce, it's over to you.
Thank you, Chair. This is without an agenda. It was just really to ask a question to get a little bit of an update on the business terrace, because I think some of us think it's a bit of a hidden gem. So the question is, please can you provide an update on the activity of the business terrace, both a breakdown of the number of users of the Maidstone Business Terrace for the current year versus the previous year as compared with projections, as well as a general update on recent and upcoming events.
Councillor Bryce, that information is included in this sheet. Do you want a little bit of time to just read through it? I believe you have a supplementary question. Would you like to have time to read this first and give the other members of the committee time? Just have a quick look through. Members, do you need some time to read it? No? It's up to you, Councillor Bryce.
No, I think that's fine. I think it's very clear. I don't have a supplementary question. I think it's all very straightforward. I guess the only thing that would be great is whether or not we think more of this information could be included in some of the wonderful updates that we see, just maybe to give councillors opportunity to attend some of the events and, you know, be involved in some of this great work. So.
Thank you. I think it was a very good question to bring because we haven't had an update for a little while. Can we leave it with Mr Bailey to think whether it's appropriate to put it into the councillor's sheet we get or whether we actually bring it through the committee more frequently? Are you content for that to happen?
Yeah, happy to take officer's recommendation on that. Thank you, Chair.
So we now turn to page 7, which is the committee work programme. Mr Green, for you to introduce, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. There's a couple of amendments that need to be made to the work programme. There was a lot on the work programme that was due to come to the meeting in February as it stood, but there's actually 2 items that will now be on the March agenda. The first of those is the Business Terrace update, number 4, and the other is number 8, the digital strategy. So those 2 switch from February to March. Thank you.
Members, are you happy with that, or does anybody have any questions? Yes, Councillor McLaughlin.
Could I just ask, because it was lacking from the Business Terrace update, in fact it wasn't included in the question, that when we do get the update later on, there are some financials attached to it, please?
Mr Green? So we move to agenda item 13, which you will find on page 8 to 18, and Mr Green, for you to introduce again.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This report describes how Kent and Medway have been successful in applying for status as a business rates retention pilot for 18-19. Going back to your meeting last September when we told you about the opportunity to apply to become a business rates retention pilot, it was recognised that to be successful, all authorities in Kent and Medway needed to take part. And after a lot of work, it was possible to get to a common ground between those authorities, and an application was submitted, and I'm delighted to say we heard just before Christmas that it was successful. So Kent and Medway will be a 100% business rates retention pilot in 18-19. And we've got a particular role here in Maidstone in that Maidstone Borough Council is the lead authority in the pilot. We were already the administering authority for the existing business rates pool, which made us the obvious choice. And being lead authority means that we'll be responsible for handling all the cash management and also for making the arrangements for distribution of the proceeds from the pilot. Now, the main benefit in the short term from being part of this pilot is that the Kent authorities get an additional 50% share of business rates growth in the area, and very roughly it's estimated that business rates growth versus the government's benchmark will be around 50 million, and it's the extra 50% that previously would have gone to government that will now come back to the participating authorities. And what the application said about the distribution of that 25 million is that there'll be 2 pots of money, a financial sustainability fund into which 70% of the proceeds will go, and a housing and commercial growth fund into which the remaining 30% will go. The financial sustainability fund is simply distributed amongst the participating authorities, and you can see in the report at Appendix A and page 16 how that money will be split up. And on current projections, we in Maidstone would get 640,000 from the Financial Sustainability Fund. The other bit, the Housing and Commercial Growth Fund, is distributed by clusters of authorities. We're part of the North Kent cluster, which is projected to receive 3.2 million, and decisions about the distribution of that money are for the leaders of the relevant authorities. But we have complete discretion over the 640,000 that's coming directly to Maidstone. So what this report does is to set out a process for how we go about using that money. And it's very important to point out that this is just a one-off pot of money. The pilot is only due to run for 1 year, 18-19. Possible that it may be extended to 19-20, but the government hasn't made any commitment to do that. So the report suggests that we should use the money in such a way that we get an ongoing benefit. So it's really for pump priming. We're looking for initiatives that will generate a long-lasting benefit for the council. And the report sets out some principles at paragraph 110, which you're asked to consider as to how we use the money. First of all, that we focus on a small number of discrete projects. So rather than spreading the money out amongst lots of different initiatives, we focus on a few projects that can really make a difference. Also, the projects need to be aligned with our strategic objectives. Obviously, you're aware of our strategic priorities, so they should link to the strategic objectives of the council. And finally, and this relates to the point about getting a bigger benefit than just the 640,000, we should try and exploit opportunities to leverage additional income, either because the money will generate income in the future, or because by putting in some money ourselves, we can attract match funding, say from the government or from Kent County Council or some other partner. So the proposal is that if you're content with that direction of travel, that we as officers develop some more detailed proposals, and when we're putting forward budget proposals to PNR on 14th of February, that we include more detail about what those proposals be, so that they can go on to Council on 28th of February for adoption as part of the budget for next year. So you're asked to note the success of the pilot application, the fact that we are due to receive what's currently estimated at 640,000, and to agree the principles for distribution of the money that we're hoping to receive. Thank you.
Councillor Bryce.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Green. I know we discussed this. Refresh my memory. When we discussed how this was going to work, was the cluster arrangement part of our original discussion? No. So how has that come about?
What happened when this was discussed in September is the committee delegated to the leader and me the authority to work with the other Kent authorities to come up with something that would make for a successful application. And as you can imagine, with 12 districts, county council and Medway, it was quite a long drawn-out process getting agreement. And what it was felt was that there had to be two elements in the distribution of the money. Some money had to go back to the individual authorities that we could use directly, but also because the government in setting the criteria for the pilot said it was looking for evidence of joint working between authorities in a geographic area, we had to demonstrate in the application that it wasn't just going to be divvied up between the member authorities. And so that was the basis for the idea of clusters, that it would demonstrate that authorities in the area were able to work together. Kent already had the theory about clusters. North Kent, this committee agreed in Maidstone's participation in North Kent a couple of years ago. West Kent, East Kent are all established groupings. So that was the logical basis for demonstrating to the government that we could work together with other authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Green. That's really clear, actually. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not going to labour the point. There's a number of folks around this table that are more comfortable with North Kent clusters, and some of us are less comfortable. But this is a kind of a one-off solution. So, you know, it's probably not fair to labour the point. In terms of, you know, I think it's a sensible suggestion to say, you know, we've got this money, let's do what we can to, you know, plant a seed and grow something. But in theory, could the funds be used to reduce something like the council tax burden for this current year?
That's certainly not what was described in the application to government, because it was intended to address the effects of growth in the area. So it wasn't about reducing costs to council taxpayers. It was looking at initiatives that councils could take to deal with the consequences of growth. So we would really be running counter to what we said in our own application if we took that approach.
Thank you. That's really clear. I think just in, you know, in terms of if you know, members of the public wonder why we're restricted and, you know, can't use it in that way, that makes that very clear. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. I must congratulate the officers for an excellent application, an excellent outcome. This is really good news for our borough. I also think it's good news for the cluster, because it just goes to show what partnership working can produce. I think the suggestion, or the necessity, if you like, for it to be a one-off, to treat it as a, if you like, capital and not revenue, is extremely sensible and highly appropriate, because if we were to use, if we were to use it for revenue, then we would have a rather large problem next year, the following year and the year after that. I think the suggestions that you have set out in the report are very clear indeed, and which I would fully support. Can I just question, on paragraph 3, the preferred option in 3.1, do you mean the proposal set out in paragraph 110, not 1.9? I need to know, because I would like to move the recommendation, because I fully support the report.
I'll second the proposal.
Do you wish to speak now, Councillor Harper? Do you wish to speak now? I do have another 3 people who do wish to speak.
I'll reserve my right to reply, that's the phrase.
Councillor English.
I'd merely observe at this point, and first of all, that it's extremely good news, even if it is a one or at best 2-off. But I would also then go on to say that what Councillor Bryce said about reducing the burden on the council taxpayer and this report is not necessarily mutually contradictory. It depends what's done with the 640,000 and the other part, the share, because obviously, as we see in the capital programme later on, and as we've done elsewhere in the council, if we invest the money wisely in either the right capital asset, whether it's some of the properties on Parkwood, where we've looked at the leases, or housing properties, or commercial property. If that secures a good, robust income to the council or reduces the cost to the council, of course, that will have a positive benefit for the council taxpayer going forward. So I think we can sort of say that the objectives are not mutually contradictory, and that hopefully, if we get this right, and there's still a lot of work to do, it will actually put the council in a better revenue situation going forward. That's certainly my hope.
Councillor Borden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, something that we've got to consider as well is we are a nationwide pilot here, and we are, across the whole of Kent, as was set out, the authority that will administer it, which will increase the burdens on our staff, not least sort of learning the new ways of working. So we've got to consider that as well. I agree with pretty much in different ways with what everyone said so far. This is good news. Obviously, it's a Kent-wide thing, and we are just a part of the jigsaw, so to speak here, but it's an important part, and it will bring lots of benefits to the borough. I think what we're really looking for, building on the point that certainly Councillor English just raised, is, okay, look, when I go and talk to the people who elected me and put me here tonight, and I go and explain that the council will have a one-off cost, one-off benefit of an additional £600,000, to most people, that's an awful lot of money. And I think what we're really looking for, and what would be useful for us as the elected representatives going forward, is actual concrete evidence in the budget plans next month as to, right, here's the additional money we're getting. We're quite rightly treating this as capital rather than revenue in the forthcoming years. Here is where that money is going to be invested. That, from our point of view, is certainly when I'm speaking to residents in fans, is something that is a good message for us to portray on the doorstep. So any help that can be given in making that very clear, I think, would be appreciated.
Mrs. Broome just wishes to come in.
I'd just like to make one point of clarification, and then just to amplify one of the things that's in the report in response to what Councillor Borton has just said. So the first thing is that what we're recommending is that we spend on a small number of projects. That they could be revenue or capital projects. So I just didn't want you to run away with the thought that this was all capital investment. It's investment in projects that will have a long-term benefit. The key differentiation is that we are recommending that we do not substitute this money for anything in our revenue-based budget, because it will not recur or may not recur in future years. So I just wanted to provide the clarification on that. And then just a point to amplify, what we're doing here is setting out some recommendations for principles or parameters for the way in which this money is spent. Once you've come to a conclusion about what you want those to be, and they may be the ones in here, you may want to suggest alternatives, then we will produce a list of proposed projects upon which to spend that money. And we felt that it was probably best to get the principles established first, and then we wouldn't have abortive time bringing forward projects that didn't meet those principles. We will bring those forward to your meeting on the 14th of February, and then, subject to your decision-making, then they will be recommended as part of the overall budget for next year to full council on the 28th. So by then, you will have something to say on the doorstep that is more crystallised than what we're saying in this report.
Councillor Borden, do you...
No, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And yeah, if that can just be earmarked so that the average person sort of in the borough can understand, I think that would be appreciated. But I do agree with the Chief Executive. I do think I agree with the principles as well. And let's hope we can get them agreed tonight.
Councillor Burton.
Very briefly, Chair, I think this is a good opportunity for us to try something. I just want to sort of put that little note of caution there. On page 13, there is that section around risk. And when you identify the source of this money and the link that that potentially has to the economic situation, the major macroeconomic events that face us in the short term, and couple that with the fact that we're not just looking at how Maidstone performs here, but it is a pooled effect. Let's not count chickens before they are hatched.
and I think it's very wise to note at 4.3 that the funds are released only to the extent that we've really got properly, not guaranteed, but anticipated income. But there is, you know, when you look at what drives this, it's how many people, how many businesses are occupying, how many commercial premises, and doing well enough to pay their uniform business rates, which is that most hated tax of businesses.
Thank you. Councillor Harper, you reserved your right. Do you wish to just say a few words?
Well, just to endorse what everybody has said, and I think picking up Councillor Burton's point, the fact that the projects, when we do get them, we need to be able to have some objective criteria to sort of do the prioritisation so that we can commit them during the course of the year as the money comes in. I note you say in the report, as it's a one-off piece of money, we don't have to spend it all in 2018-19. So by prioritising some of the projects, if they slip to the following year, that would be fine, you know, in terms of making sure that we don't overcommit ourselves on this project. I think it's really great, and hopefully the government, given the slippage in business rates coming, you know, legislation coming forward, will extend the pilots to subsequent years. That's what we've got to hope for, and be ready as soon as we see any inkling of that, obviously, to latch on to it.
Councillor McLaughlin, you have indicated.
Thank you, Chair. We've been focusing on the potential 640,000. I'm still not clear on the Housing and Commercial Growth Fund, where on the table on page 16, we seem to have £250,000 allocated to us as well, and yet in para 111, the actual allocation of that fund across the North West grouping, by the looks of it, will be decided by a committee made up of the council leaders. Can you just clarify for me, do we have £250,000 as well? Don't we? What are we going to spend that on?
Mr Green, do you want to elucidate, please?
Sorry, Councillor McLaughlin, where are you seeing the 250,000?
I've seen it on the table on page 16. On the last but one column.
The 250,000 is part of the calculation of the 640,000, which is the Financial Sustainability Fund. And the idea is that that's the minimum that an authority would get, and then that figure is inflated based on the factors that are shown in the table. That's completely separate from what you see on page 17, which is the Housing Commercial Growth Fund, which is split pro rata between the authorities, and you can see what are called the business rates baseline figures, which is basically the size of the business rates base in each authority, and so if you allocate that 266 million pro rata between the clusters, you get to the shares of the growth fund that are shown on page 17, North Kent share being 3.2 million. So that's a completely different calculation from the one that's used to arrive at the 640,000.
Okay. May I, Chair, just continue? So I don't quite understand what the 250,000 is telling us. You're saying it's part of the 640? And if the total North Kent cluster for the Housing and Commercial Growth Fund is 3.291 million, as shown on page 17, how are we going to know how much of that we might get our way if it's going to be decided, the allocation is going to be decided by committee?
The principle with the Housing Commercial Growth Fund is that it's allocated to the North Kent authorities collectively. So we won't necessarily be getting a particular chunk of that 3.2 million. What may happen is that those North Kent cluster authorities may say that there's a fund for, say, town centre regeneration in North Kent, into which individual authorities could apply, but it won't be distributed pro rata between the authorities. It is collectively for North Kent.
Do you mind if I come in? If I come in here, because Mrs. Broome and myself have both been attempting to get the other authorities in the cluster to actually get together to decide principles in the same way that we've brought the principles for here to you tonight. And as yet, we haven't got a date, have we? Have we? We haven't got a date. Mrs. Broome.
Okay, so if I could just make a comment about governance. So the Kent leaders together, and as Mark explained earlier with the delegations, we were in a position to agree the split 70-30. What we didn't describe in the bid was how the governance of decision-making would work for the 30%, the 3.29 million that will go to the cluster that we're part of. There is an informal part of the process, and then there will need to be a formal part. The informal part is a dialogue amongst the 5 authorities, plus Kent County Council, who form the North Kent cluster. The dialogue about what proposals might come forward has not yet happened, but there is a leaders' meeting at the end of March to start that process off. Now, we've observed earlier that we won't start spending any money until we have certainty that that money will exist. So there is some time for us to be able to spend in developing those principles. Before any of those authorities can sign up, there needs to be consideration by the individual authorities as to whether or not those principles are acceptable. So I would envisage there being a report coming to this committee so that this authority can form its own formal position as to what those principles are. So I think at the moment, anything that we describe is speculative, and I think the thing that we can take confidence from is the fact that we have worked quite successfully on a similar basis when we've been working as part of the Mid-Kent Improvement Partnership, where you have several members. There is a discussion amongst the authorities together, but then there needs to be sovereign decision-making to back up the conclusions that are reached, or not back it up. Yeah. So we can't give you clarity at the moment as to exactly how that money will be distributed. I can go really no further than to describe the process for that.
Okay, Councillor McLaughlin.
Yes, I think I'm just trying to get ahead of the game, really. And you've explained the situation as it is. Thanks.
I think we'd both like to get ahead of the game too, but we can only move as fast as the slowest council. So, and I think we're probably the fastest that want to push ahead, but we will get there. And we are always pointing out that we have a committee system here, and we do have to come back to get decision-making made. I have nobody else indicating. Councillor Gooch, just for Mr Bailey's, so just so we're absolutely certain, what was it you were saying needed to be changed here? It's in the body of the report.
Sorry, it's in the body. It was on section 3, preferred option, on page 12. There just needed to be an amendment so that it reads: the preferred option is that the committee agrees the proposal set out in paragraph 1.10, not 1.9 as written on page 12.
Thank you. So I have nobody else indicating to speak. This has been proposed by Councillor Gooch, seconded by Councillor Harper. Are you content to take all 3 sections together, or do you want it taken individually? Together? Can I hear that that is so? Thank you. Then can I have a show of hands for those for, please? I think that's unanimous. That's unanimous. That's carried. Thank you very much. Yes, so we go to agenda item 14, which you will find on pages 19 to 35. And Mr Green, you've got a full evening tonight. It's for you to bring this to us as well.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This report sets out proposals for the next 5 years' capital programme, and the capital programme describes how the Council can really make a difference to the Borough over the next 5 years. The total spend is 75 million, and you can see what's proposed on page 35. Appendix C gives a snapshot of all the schemes that are in the proposed programme. If you look at that, you can see that the biggest single item is housing and regeneration, which has been subject of discussion here before. That accounts for 34 million out of the 75 million. But the capital programme also includes spend on parks and open spaces, property investment, and a whole range of other projects. The programme builds on the existing agreed capital programme, which is set out in Appendix A, but there are a couple of changes that the report highlights that I'd like to just mention. First of all, we've added a new project, which is described at paragraph 141, to carry out works that we're under a statutory obligation to do at Moat Park Lake. And this was subject to a report to this committee back in April. We simply have no alternative but to do this work. The Environment Agency requires us to do so and could easily levy penalties if we don't carry out that work. So that's estimated as 1.9 million, but at this stage we don't have detailed figures for the design, and we'll be coming back to the committee, I hope in April, with more information on that. The other big change to the capital programme is a proposal to expand the commercial investment programme, and this is described at paragraph 148. We've got a good track record, I think, of investments, for example, on the Parkwood Industrial Estate, and this is proposing that we expand the funding for those type of investments. To give some structure to that, I'm planning to bring a report to this committee with a formal property investment strategy so that you can see what our parameters are for investing that money. But we just wanted at this stage to set out the overall spending envelope, which is 12.5 million in these proposals. The report also deals with how we fund the capital programme. Now, as you know, up until now, the Council's not had to borrow to fund its capital programme. We've put New Homes Bonus towards capital funding, and we've used our own reserves, what we call internal borrowing. So up until now, we've not had a direct impact on our revenue costs from the capital programme. We haven't had to borrow. Appendix B on page 34 shows the funding projections, and that's showing that the money from New Homes Bonus won't be sufficient in the future to fund the capital programme. We don't know what will happen to New Homes Bonus after 1920, and in any case, the amounts we're getting are diminishing every year. So the report states that we will be borrowing according to the prudential rules, and the report sets out principles for prudential borrowing. Most importantly, that schemes funded from prudential borrowing do cover the cost of funding. So, in summary, you're asked to agree the capital strategy principles, the funding projections at Appendix B, the detail of the capital programme that's proposed in Appendix C, and to note that the implications of that are that over the 5 years, we could be borrowing up to 44.6 million to fund the capital programme. Very happy to take questions on the detail of the report.
Councillor Bryce.
Sorry, it's always me first, isn't it? Thank you, Mr Green. That's very detailed. I think a lot of this is, data that or information that we've seen before. Just had a couple of specific questions. The software PC replacement, we've got, I'm sure you've let us know what this is before, but there's a large sum, 2021. Could you remind us what that is for that 247? Because that's quite a lot of computers, but I don't think it is for that, is it?
It is, in fact, for IT replacement because, it's as it says in the description, we've got in a state of computer equipment that does require replacement from time to time. A lot of the equipment is getting to the end of its useful life. So the head of IT has come up with some quite detailed proposals about how we deal with the need for ongoing replacement of kit. So a lot of this is hardware, and it's money that we have to spend to keep the IT infrastructure of the council fit for purpose.
So how many computers do we have then? Because £225,000, so it is a lot of computers.
I don't have the detail of the individual numbers, but I'm quite happy to provide you with information on what that is and what the proposals in detail set out.
Yeah, I'd like to see that because it feels high. This is what you get when you're married to an IT director. The other main point, and I don't think this is going to be unexpected given some of the correspondence we've had, is, obviously I think we all buy into the idea, it's one of our strategic policies, is the need to invest in the town centre. But there's an awful lot of folk in this borough who don't live in the town centre who might visit Moat Park more intermittently than others. And I would just like reassurance, really, that where we do have more discretionary spend, so maybe in the kind of parks improvement budget, that places like Staplehurst aren't forgotten, or, the other villages that are taking an awful lot of housing. And there is declining infrastructure, and I have said this time and time again at this committee, but I'd really welcome seeing some investment in these communities, because I can't see anything coming into these villages. And, we are a ribbon village. We've had 2 more closures on top of the other ones I've described in our high street. And it just can't go on. We really do need to see some capital investment in some of these rural areas. And I know it's difficult because, every single village could sit here and sell you the same pitch. But it's just where we do have any ability or flexibility to look at prioritising that money, I'd really welcome seeing some of that investment being made, not just in the urban area.
Councillor English.
And of course, the details of this will be finalised later on when we have the discussion on the budget, but it sets out a reasonably comprehensive framework. I would merely observe that there have been things going on elsewhere in the council, and one of the things that has taken place has been the employment of a delivery officer in order to ensure that 106 contributions have been collected for parks and open spaces, which is across the borough, are actually collected. Well, we've done the collection part mostly, but actually are spent, and that will help considerably in relation not just to the town centre but to parks and open spaces and hopefully nature reserves across the borough. I would say that there are points of detail here that I could argue about in terms of some of the headings, but tonight isn't really the particular night for detailed discussion on each individual item. I think the report sets out a pretty good framework for the discussion. Just one minor question. Hardware has been mentioned in another context. We had a discussion at strategic planning about renewal and replacement of equipment in the borough council's car parks, which is something we'll be looking at. Is this already factored into this capital programme, or would that be something that would be funded from the car park revenue stream? Can I just have clarification?
Yes, the intention with the money that's being used for investment in parking equipment is that that comes from parking revenues. It's not part of this capital programme.
Before I bring in Councillor Harper, who's next, I think as Councillor Bryce and Councillor Perry knows, Mr Cornell has been involved quite a lot, for instance, with Staplehurst. Can you give us an update on what's happening there?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. In terms of Staplehurst, we've got this topic on the agenda for our next strategic issues meeting to explore the redevelopment potential of the land around the station. And I think it's a project that we're going to put forward for funding in relation to the funding stream outlined by Mr Green in the previous paper. So hopefully that will be positively received. Thank you.
Councillor Perry, I will, if it's on that point, I will let you come in if that's all right. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for that. This is important. I have raised this, actually, the whole approach with our parish council as well, so I think they're on board as well. So I do appreciate the work, and we are working together on this to try and get a positive outcome. It is quite difficult because land around the station, there are sensitive issues here, but I mean, we've got to think a little bit, dare I use jargon, outside the box a little bit, and I think this is what we're trying to do. So there is potential, but we've got to look at it obviously quite carefully. But I do appreciate the work that's been done already. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Harper.
Thank you. I think what would be helpful, perhaps at our meeting on the 14th of February, is to be able to see, obviously, when we're looking at our finances in the bigger picture, having a look at the monies which are set aside in Section 106 currently, and perhaps things like the parking reserves and these various other ways of funding capital, because it's a holistic picture we need to look at, isn't it? I think if you just look at this, you get the impression that the council's only planning over the next 5 years to invest £100,000 in parks and open spaces in the borough. But a lot of the Section 106 monies which we've collected are still yet to be spent on parks and open spaces, probably over the similar period. So I think it'd be useful to see that. So actually then we're in a better situation to decide whether we need to potentially augment the £100,000 here by a higher figure because of the needs of parks, other than clearly Moat Park, which features prominently. The other thing another point I just wondered about was the IT funding. Obviously, you know, as you said, we need to replace this £500,000 worth of IT equipment. But I've just wondered whether we use anything like a sinking fund, so that every year, for instance, we set money aside into our reserve, so that when it comes to replacement, the money comes out of a particular fund, rather than, you know, coming out of our relatively scarce capital resources. Or if it isn't done, perhaps consideration could be given to looking at that, because I know I was asked to raise that same issue at the Upper Medway Internal Drainage Board last week. And yes, so as I say, perhaps if we could have a bit more information on those things, say on the 14th. But other than that, I'm quite happy to move the recommendations on page 19, isn't it? It's the 4 recommendations there.
Is that seconded by anybody? Councillor English. I do have Councillor Gooch to speak, but just before we go there, good evening, Councillor Blackmore. Glad you made it safely. Can I ask whether you have any declaration or any disclosures of lobbying?
No, Madam Chairman, nothing to declare or disclose.
All right, thank you very much. Councillor Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a bit of clarification, please, on page 30. The risks section, 4.2, you do say that it'll require considerable capacity for delivery and project management in the future. Could you just tell me what we're doing about that? Have we factored that in? How are we going to manage that?
Yes, the point is made there that the programme involves a scale of expenditure greater than I think has been the case in the Council in recent years. So a lot of attention is being given with these projects to make sure that there's project management arrangements in place, and for instance with the Union Street and Brunswick Street housing developments, which your committee is going to see details of shortly. We're certainly very conscious of that, and Mr Cornell may want to add about how project management is working, but I thought it was important in this section to just flag up that these programmes don't just happen by themselves, they require that level of project management skill. And, yeah.
Councillor Perry, I will let you come back and then we're going to move to the vote.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was well away there. 2 points I just wanted to raise. The play areas. It mentions this. This has been around as long as I've been a councillor, I think. This 12 minutes criteria, which does. Is this still being rigid? It's a question I've got. Is this still being rigidly applied, or do we have some flexibility in this? Because it seems to me that in some cases it's not quite right. I don't understand the 12 minutes either, where it actually ever came from. And I was ex-cabinet member who was involved with this. I still don't understand it. That's my first question. The second one is more of a, just wanted to get some reassurance. The Moat Park Dam, which is obviously a very, very serious piece of work. And I see you've got a range here between 1.4 million and 1.9 million. And what I just wanted reassurance on here is I'm a bit scared on something that is such a major public safety matter that we don't sort of, and I'm sure you won't, but they're not tempted to go for the value for money bit here. I think we need to get this one really right, given what's happened, as we know, tragically elsewhere on a different issue, but similar criteria come to place, that I think we've got to be very, very sure that we get this one really, really right. So that's really why I wanted the reassurance on. I mean, it's so terribly important. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Perry, I think we all endorse that, and I know that the officers are waiting to get it absolutely right. So we'll get the report back here sooner rather than later, I hope. Sorry, Councillor. Mr Cornell, first of all, could you answer the question about the 12 minutes, but maybe something on project management as well, as that's been raised?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. In terms of the parks and the 12 minutes, that was all sort of dealt with in a decision made by the Heritage, Culture and Leisure Committee 2 or 3 months ago. There wasn't a definitive decision made that evening, but what was decided broadly was that where parks did reach the end of their, life, if having explored all other funding opportunities, Section 106 and so forth, they would be sort of grouped together and brought back for sort of formal decision by that committee in groups. So there is a degree of flexibility. And then, sort of turning to Councillor Gooch's question about project management, the capital projects obviously do require new skill sets, and we are bringing that resource in. I think that the way we're doing it, which I would favour for the long term as well, is that we bring in consultancy services to cover important skills such as architectural services for the housing projects, for example, and then aligned to that as well, we bring in a role which is kind of termed employer's agent, which is like a hybrid role between quantity surveyor and project manager, and they help us with the specification, procurement and contract administration of these projects. Okay.
Councillor Blackmore, you in?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just 2 short questions. The first relates to temporary accommodation and the fact that going forward we're looking at allocating 600,000 per annum, and I was just wondering where this figure has come from, whether that's a specific number of units or that's just a number that's been plucked from the air. The second question relates to feasibility studies and money being set aside, and it says schemes not yet ready to be included. Are you able to give us a rough idea of what the schemes are, even though they may not be completely ready to launch, as it were?
Please.
Yes, on the two questions. The temporary accommodation, there's a proposal to acquire another 15 units in 1819. The 600,000 in subsequent years is really just a marker. I mean, that would buy 2, maybe 3 units a year, but that we need to revisit that every year depending on how the situation is going with temporary accommodation. So we will look at it again next year. And sorry, the other point that you raised about feasibility studies, we do from time to time have situations where schemes come up that may repay further investigation but aren't part of the capital programme. So, for example, things like the Moat Park Lake Dam, where we have to spend a bit of money just to find out whether there is a capital scheme there, and that's what that feasibility money is for. Obviously, its expenditure of that is subject to the Council's usual standing orders, but it just gives us the flexibility to investigate whether schemes are appropriate for inclusion in the programme.
Thank you, Mr Green. The second part didn't quite answer my question, because I wondered if there was actually anything ready to launch. So something's already been looked at, i.e. certain projects have been, I don't know, shelved, but there are 1 or 2 that actually are ready to be looked at because, let's say, they could be hot projects or semi-warm projects. The other thing with the 600,000 for temporary accommodation, my feeling is that's very low, given the current situation and given the information that we already know about more homes being required, possibly at the point of our next completed review in relation to the local plan, which is why I query that figure, because I would have thought that's conservative small c and ought to be raised somewhat.
On the first one about the feasibility studies, I can't give any examples because we've obviously tried to put everything that we know about at the moment in the capital programme that's in front of you. It's really, should further things come up over the next 12 months that aren't in the capital programme that we need to investigate. And I mean, for example, there's work around town centre opportunity sites. Things like that might require some investment in feasibility studies. So that's that one. And on the temporary accommodation, this line for temporary accommodation is simply for temporary accommodation, where we have a number of households in temporary accommodation. We hope that the number won't increase over the next few years and that by acquiring another 15 units in 1819, that will be enough. That's quite separate from the much bigger picture about the housing that has to be delivered as part of the local plan. And to an extent, that's addressed in the housing and regeneration line, because that allows the council itself to contribute to meeting the local plan targets. But this line about temporary accommodation is just for temporary accommodation, not for the overall local plan targets.
I think the committee generally wants some more information on the IT aspect, so we must ensure that actually that comes through, please. But having said that, members, this has been proposed and seconded. Are you happy to take all 4 recommendations together? Yes. Could I have a show of hands then, please, for those in favour? Councillor English, are you going to come back and vote then? Well, no amendments have been made to the recommendations on the paper. I can't see what Councillor Bryce is doing. Councillor Bryce, we can't see for Councillor Bolton. I'm sorry, you were... No. You were sitting forward. There was nothing meant other than you were sitting forward. And against? Abstention? 1. That is carried. Thank you very much. And now, without further ado, we are doing very well, actually. Can we move to agenda item 15, which you'll find on pages 36 to 46? And again, Mr. Green, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This report is the regular annual review of fees and charges, with particular reference to services within this committee's remit. But the report does also cover in Appendix 2 the position on fees and charges across the Council. The report proposes fees and charges for next year. The main changes for 18-19 are for legal services, where there's some inflationary increases to fees and charges. Actually, the biggest source of fee income in this committee's remit is the work of the Mid-Kent Enforcement Service, the bailiff service, but their fees are set by statute, so they're just provided for information here. They're not subject to a decision for this committee. And after the Mid-Kent Enforcement Service, the next biggest source of income is the business terrace. Now, we haven't proposed any changes in charges for the business terrace in 18-19 because there was quite a significant hike in charges last year, so there aren't any more changes proposed. And you may have noticed on page 43, one of the things we charge for in the business terrace is hot desks, and the note should read prices are unchanged due to lack of market demand, not, as it says, due to market demand, because the hot desk, as opposed to the permanent space, is not fully utilised. We didn't want to put prices up because it might deter people from taking those on. So, again, I'm happy to take any questions on the detail in the report. Thank you.
Councillor Burton, you were...
Very quick one, if I may, Madam Chair. Just looking at page 45, could you remind me of the context, the background in relation to the staff parking and the charges, who the spaces are offered to, who actually pays, and the rationale for the price that's mentioned there for the fee?
Certainly, Councillor Burton. The fee is where employees aren't entitled to park in the Maidstone House car park, and there are some employees who are designated because of their requirement for a car parking space as having an entitlement to space. But if an employee who isn't entitled wants to buy a season ticket, this is the price that we would charge for it.
Wanted to come back?
If I may come back, it joins with context of a fairly involved conversation with myself and the Vice Chair, looking at the paper that's coming to strategic planning shortly on fees and charges car parks, and I'm just concerned that there should be a degree of consistency and perhaps an avoidance of hypocrisy potentially in how we charge, where we subsidise, a policy for the public and a different one for ourselves.
Do you wish to come back?
We can certainly review that and make sure there's some consistency there. I mean, the reality is that offer of parking isn't one that's available to as many people as want it, because there is a constraint on the space in Maidstone House.
I mean, if I may, a supply and demand economic solution would suggest an outcome there. So we are going to look at it, and I'm wondering how we're going to look at it and how we bring this forwards, whether it can feed into the report that's being prepared for strat planning. And I'm putting this in the context of, I think, the season tickets that we offer, which are twice the price and perhaps rather more prescriptive than these.
Officers, I'm sure that can feed in, can't it? Yeah, I can liaise with
colleagues who are working on that report and make sure we address the issue.
Councillor Harper, you in it?
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, the first one actually was just to agree with what Councillor Burton just said. I mean, the minimum we need to make sure is that these parking spaces, we're fully charging to the staff members actually what it's costing the council to effectively purchase them. Because we shouldn't be looking to subsidise staff parking, you know, for non-essential users. I mean, you know, why should a few people be able to park cheaper than other members of staff? So there's an issue about equality there. I also had a question on the Jubilee Square proposal. Obviously, a couple of years ago, we clearly took in a lot more money than we've been doing recently. I know from my own experience of hiring it, some of the problems which were incurred there, can I seek assurance from the officers that all the facilities, particularly the electricity and so on, now are working you know, properly, as opposed to earlier this year when there was quite a lot of problems with things, you know, kicking out and so on. That's one thing. And the other thing is on page 46, since we've got the opportunity to look at the fees and charges across the whole council as well as the ones for this committee, and I was just wondering if there's any comments in terms of a couple of the fairly substantial reductions going on. So environmental enforcement and community protection going down from 101,000 to 2,000. And the other one was obviously the market going down from just under 180,000 to about 140,000. They're both, you know, fairly significant drops as far as I can see at a time when obviously the council's finances and everything else is under massive pressure. So it'd just be useful, I think, for Policy and Resources to understand, you know, what's going on in those two areas.
Yes, Mr. Green.
Yeah, happy to respond to those questions, Councillor Harper. Yeah, I was aware of the issues about Jubilee Square, and I believe they've been taken on board, and clearly we wouldn't want to charge people for a service that it can't be delivered. On the detail on page 46, the two changes that you mentioned have been covered in the relevant service committees. First of all, on environmental enforcement and community protection, this is because we did have an income stream from the fines levied by Kingdom Security, and that contract was terminated. And although we still have the capacity to collect income through fines, the volume is likely to drop. That position is subject to review, but for the time being, we're not seeing the income that we had from Kingdom. And on the market, that's the market at Lockmeadow, and the drop in 40,000 is recognising the reality that income has been below budget in recent years, and although they're taking steps to try and address it, it's just unrealistic to stick with the budget that we've got at the moment. We're not achieving the income, particularly from the weekday market that's in the budget at the moment.
Not quite yet, Councillor Bryce. Councillor Burton, is it on something that you want to come back on?
Just
your
very
original?
directly relating to that, Councillor Harper picked up on the parking thing and I think was making the point of questioning why we offer a subsidised parking to our staff. And I just wanted to make it very clear that I wasn't necessarily referring to that being the issue, because I do recognise that often affordable parking is something that is a key factor with actually attracting staff and retaining staff. And my question is perhaps more why we are persecuting the public, not why we are subsidising our staff. Did you just see the clear distinction in what I'm saying?
I think persecuting is, with my religious background at a convent school, I don't think I'd put parking in quite the same category as persecution, but we take on board what you are saying. Councillor Ing.
Councillor Harper has partly said what I was asked what I was going to ask, but can I just clarify? In terms of Jubilee Square, Mr. Green said the point had been taken on board. Did that mean that we were simply not charging the same amount of money, or did that mean that the capital issue, the issue of the electricity supply, had actually been addressed, or was being addressed? Because it has been quite problematic. So that's point one, because I wasn't clear on what you meant by that. Possibly. Secondly, on On the enforcement, I understand where we've been with the unhappy experience in many ways with Kingdom and perhaps their enthusiasm to issue penalty charges for feeding ducks and various things. But it has to be borne in mind that if we don't enforce to a certain degree, that has the opportunity to knock on to vastly increase costs throughout the rest of the council's operations in terms of people may well feel that it's safe to litter, may well feel it's safe to fly tip, and that would have a major cost implication. So I would just urge members not to, throw the baby out with the bathwater, to add to all the cliches that could be said on the subject, because, under enforcement for whatever reason does have serious knock-on implications.
Mr. Cornell.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, at the Housing Committee, we did bring forward a proposal to trial a new sort of community officer team that would take on some of the tasks that Kingdom were doing. So that's going to be launched fairly early in the next financial year. So that has got potential to levy some charges as well. So, but it's obviously going to be less certain than the arrangement under Kingdom. But we are proposing to carry on, enforcing, albeit on a trial period, whilst we see how the in-house team does.
My understanding is that the electrical supply issue has been addressed.
Councillor Bryce.
Thank you very much, Chair. It was just on the Section 106 planning agreement fees. Is it generally paid by large developers? I just wonder if we're being too conservative, or is that a fee that we're constrained on?
Mr. Cornell, who wants to answer that one?
Madam Chair, if I can just clarify, there is a legal requirement that we charge costs on the basis of the cost of recovery of the service, and we cannot make a profit when making those charges. So we do try our best when applying the hourly rate to ensure that all overhead costs and associated costs are recovered, to ensure that we maximise the recovery. Thank you.
Very quickly, Councillor.
Strategic Planning Committee has agreed the scale of charges for planning performance agreement. It's also agreed to look on a cost recovery basis to that pre-application discussions for all developers on a cost recovery basis, not to make a profit obviously, but to reduce overheads to the council.
Councillor McLaughlin.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, I understand some councils are considering introducing parking charges for disabled parking spaces. Can I have an assurance that this council isn't considering doing that?
William, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. We haven't had any proposals come forward on that front at all, but perhaps the Chair of the Strategic Planning Committee would have a view to.
I could add that I'm not aware of any proposed changes in regard to disabled parking, in regard to fees. But it's a question that could be verified when we look at this next month.
It's certainly been in the press. That has been in the press, but nothing here so far. So, yes, Councillor Harper.
Yeah, I'd like to formally move the recommendations on page 36, recommendations 1 through to 3, if we've not already done.
Seconded by Councillor English. It's only one that is for agreement, so can I take it that the two are noted and that the one is agreed? Those in favour, please show. It's beautifully done, thank you. Well, that's unanimous. Members, that closes the meeting.